In this lesson, we're going to be learning about the context API in React, and we're going to be seeing how this API allows us to easily share data across several components. In the previous lesson, we learned about prop drilling, which is a case where you have to pass props from one component down through several components until you get to the target component. So we saw this example where this app component has an is logged in state, and then we want to pass this is logged in to this dashboard link component. So what we had to do is we had to pass this from the app component to the layout component, and here in the layout component we had to pass this to the header component, and then from the header component we had to pass this to the dashboard link, and then here in the dashboard link we say if it's logged in is true, we return dashboard, and if it is not true, then we return sign in. So if we go back to this app component now, is logged in is currently false, so we have sign in here, but then if I should change this to true, now we have dashboard here. Now this is prop drilling. And when you have a lot of prop drilling in your application, things can become harder to manage. There are a lot of ways you can avoid prop drilling in React. It might involve restructuring your component. So instead of keeping the state of is logged in here, you might come to dashboard link component and actually keep the state of is logged in so that you don't have to pass is logged in from other parent components. But then what if you also wanted to use this is logged in state in another component? Let's say in this layout, you wanted to use that is logged in state in this footer. So currently if we open footer, it just returns a user is logged in, which we have here. But then let's say footer also receives is logged in, and then here we can say if is logged in, then return a user is logged in, else return no user, and then we pass is logged in here from the layout component. Now in this case, because we're using is logged in several places, it might not make sense to then manage is logged in this dashboard link. Instead, we would want to manage it in a general parent component like app, or we can also manage it here in layout. Well, when it comes to cases like this where you want to easily share data across different components, there are several solutions you can use, even external solutions. But then React also provides the context API, which allows you to do just this. So how do you use the context API? Well, we're going to be creating our context in this app component. So here we're going to import React, and then here we can now create our context, and let's just call this auth context. Then we can say React create context, and this is how we create our context. You can either do react.create context, or you can import create context and just use it directly. This is how I would often do it, but you can do it any way that works. And then create context receives an argument, which is the initial value in the context. So let's say our initial value here is just going to be null, but you can pass a string, you can pass a number, you can pass whatever data. Also, it's common for you to find the context starting with a capital letter instead of a small letter. Now that we have this context, we can now provide it to children components by using the provider component on this context. So how do we do that? Well, here we can say auth context dot provider. So we have the provider component, and then I can put the layout in here. So this provider component is going to provide this context to all of these children components. So the layout would have access to this context. Any other components that we have here would also have access to that context. So now that we have this context provided to this component, how can we consume the context? This is what we can use the use context hook. So I want to use this context in the dashboard link. Now in this component, I can say auth context is equal to use context. I import this from React, and then as an argument to this use context, I am going to pass this context that I created here. So now I can do export const auth context, and then in dashboard link, I can import auth context. So here I am importing it from the app component like this. So you can have your auth context here and import it like this, or another way you can do this is you can create another file. Let's say in this src, I can create a file called context.js, and then I can put this context here. So that way it is easier to manage the auth context from one place. So I can put this context in my context.js here, and then here I'm going to import create context. Then I can come back to this app.jsx. I can remove this create context import, and then I can import auth context from that context JavaScript file. And then here in the dashboard link, instead of importing auth context from here, I can now import it from the context file. So this is how I consume the context. But then if we come back to our context provider here, I haven't defined the values that I want to provide to the component, and this is where I can use the value prop. So I can say value, and then you can pass any value here. For example, I can pass a string, and now if I should come back to this dashboard link and I do console log auth context, here we have string. And if I should come to this context and instead of providing a string, I provide a number, if I refresh here, you can see we have 100 passed to that context in dashboard link. But then instead of passing string or passing number, you can also pass an array or even an object. So here I can pass an object, and in this object I'm going to have one property for is logged in, which is this. So it's the same thing as doing is logged in, but I'm just going to do it once. Now, if I should refresh, you can see that in dashboard link, when we do console log auth context, what we are getting is logged in false, which is coming from the app component. And now that I have it like this, I no longer need to pass is logged in to layout. So I can delete this is logged in prop. And if I go to layout, I can also delete this is logged in, remove it from my prop types, and I can remove this is logged in from the header and remove it from the footer, and then I can go to header, also remove this is logged in, and also remove it from the prop types here, and also remove it from the dashboard link. You can see how context API is making things easy for us. I'm removing all of these props that I had to pass through several components, and now I can come to the dashboard link. I can also remove this is logged in from here since it is no longer coming in from a prop. And now instead of doing if is logged in, I can now say if auth context dot is logged in. And then I have this. So now if I should refresh, you see we don't have any errors. I have this logged in coming here. I can do the same thing in footer. So here in footer, instead of receiving is logged in via a prop, I can come here again and say auth context. Then I say use context, and then I'm going to pass the context that I created. So that is auth context. So I'm importing it from this context file. And then here I can say again auth context dot is logged in. So if it is logged in, we have a user is logged in, else we have no user. And what you see now is we don't have to pass props across several components. This footer has access to the context because this footer is a child or a grandchild of this provider. Also, this dashboard link, I can have access to this context because the dashboard link is a grandchild of this provider. And now if I should change this state to true, you're going to see here we have dashboard from the dashboard link, and here we have a user is logged in from the footer component. These components have access to the context data, and once that context changes, any value in the context changes, these components would have access to the current value. So you can think of these components, when they do use context, it's like they are subscribing to that context, and when anything happens to that context, these components, in this case our footer, would be informed of the new state. Now, one way you'd see people using the use context is that instead of having const auth context equals use context this, and then here we have auth context dot is logged in, you can also destructure. So here I can destructure the returned value from this use context, and then I can get is logged in. So now I can clear this, and now I have is logged in. So destructure this from the context. We can do the same thing with dashboard link, and then I'm going to again destructure is logged in from this context. So now I have this, and this works fine. Now, what if we wanted to update this state? This is another beauty of the context API. You can also pass this setIsLoggedIn function to other components so that those other components can call setIsLoggedIn and they can update the state to true. And this is how you can update the context. So we can choose to update this context directly here in the app component, maybe with the trigger of a button or API call. We can say setIsLoggedIn true. We can do that directly here in the app component, but we can as well do it from this dashboard link, or we can do it from the footer, or we can even do it from the header, since the header is a grandchild of this provider component. But before you can do that, you have to pass that to this value prop. Remember again, the components that are consuming this context would only be able to consume the values that you pass to this value prop. So here I can pass setIsLoggedIn, and if I come to this footer component, for example, I can also destructure the setIsLoggedIn function. And now let's just say I have a button here which just says log in. And now we can say when you click this button, we're going to have our callback function. And in this callback function, we're going to say setIsLoggedIn true. And then we can have another button here. We're going to have log out. And this logout, when you click on it, we're going to have setIsLoggedIn false. Now, if I come back to this footer, if I click on logged in, watch what happens to this sign in and to this no user. When I click on login, it calls this setIsLoggedIn and it passes a value of true. I remember setIsLoggedIn is coming from here. So we are actually calling this function and passing a new state. And now that the state of isLoggedIn is now true, that is going to be passed to the dashboard link. So now we're going to have dashboard here, and it is also going to be passed to the footer. And here in this footer, we say if it's logged in, it should have a user is logged in. So we have that here. And now watch what happens when I also click on logout. If I click on logout, this would call setIsLoggedIn and pass false. And that new state is going to be reflected in dashboard link. So in that case, sign in would be returned, which is what we have here. And as well in the footer component, when isLoggedIn is false, we have no user, and we have that here. So you can see how context allows us to not only share data across different components, but also allow different components to be able to update the main data. Now, coming back to this provider component, like I said, only the components that are children of this provider component would have access to the context provided by the provider. Does that make sense? So what that means is, let's say I have a div here, and let's just say I put all of this here. And then let's say I put footer here. Now what we're going to have now is an error, because in footer, we are trying to access the auth context. But then when we use footer here, it is not part of this context. So now if we should check the console, we should see some errors that makes sense. So the error says that cannot destructure property is logged in of use context as it is null, which means when you use this instance of the footer component, this returns null. And if you're wondering why it's null, that's because when we created this context, we gave it an initial value of null. So when you try to use the footer component with this context and an instance of the footer component is not under this provider, then instead of the footer component to have access to these values, it will instead have access to only the initial value. When you use footer in this layout, this is not going to return null. This is going to return the context provided by this, because footer is a child of layout and layout is a child of this provider. So footer has access to the provider. But then in this case, footer doesn't have access to any provider because we don't have any provider wrapped around it. So the only way that would work is if, I'm just going to repeat myself, if we have a provider like this and then I put footer in it, Then now if I should refresh, you see we don't have any errors. We have the footer before we have the layout below. So it is very important that you have your provider before you try to use context. I hope this lesson gives you a better understanding of the context API and show you how they can be useful for passing data across several components. Now, this does not mean you should use context API for everything. If you have a simple parent and child component, you can simply use prop for that. But then if you have some data that you want to pass across different components, both nested components and not nested components, then using the context API for such data passing or data updating can be much more easier to manage in your application.